go ahead and get started. Appreciate you coming and joining us in this session. We're going to be talking about loving leadership. I want to really begin by saying that in many ways we're all leaders. There's certainly informal leadership that we're involved in, whether it's in the home, whether it's as an influencer or a mentor. And there's certainly formal leadership in the church, deacons, elders. And the more that we have a formality of our leadership role, the more important a lot of things we're going to talk about will be. Before I begin, I want to kind of introduce myself. Part of it is so that, for those of you who don't know me, it brings at least a little bit of credibility to the things I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to be talking about Scripture, but I'm also going to be talking about experiences in various ways. And so just so you know that at least I have some set of experiences in this. I served as an elder for 21 years for a congregation in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in the kingdom. That's a certainly important work. I'm a past chairman and board of trustee member of Freed-Hardeman University. And so I've been there for 21 years. And, that's a different kind, but certainly spiritual type of important leadership. Secularly, I'm the chief executive officer of a public company. And so I have 1,200 employees, a company with $1.5 billion cap. And if you're into such things, it's easy to remember our ticker symbol. It's CASH, C-A-S-H. Be very easy to remember that. And so I have, those kinds of experiences as well that I bring when I think about spiritual leadership and then the things that you do. So not to say all that to say, listen to me, but at least I have some application of these things in day-to-day life. I want to begin by creating a tension in your mind that is a biblical tension. And it's important for you to have that before we can go into how we talk about loving leadership. Draw your attention first to Matthew chapter 20, a text that you know pretty well, beginning with verse 20. This is when James and John came to Jesus and they wanted, special seats in the kingdom. And they had a mindset that was around that. Likely they had a view of the kingdom was going to be a physical kingdom anyway. So they had that misunderstanding. But as Jesus addresses this, down in verse 25 of Matthew chapter 20, he says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave." And then he gives the example, "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." And so Jesus in this text turns worldly leadership on its head and completely takes away the concepts of authority, position, power. Lording it over is a phrase that's used frequently in Scripture, and interjects in that a servant leadership mindset, humility into the leadership as you carry these things out. It's going to be different than the command and control that is so common in the corporate world, in the military world, and any other kind of secular activity. Servant leadership in the kingdom is vastly different, and it doesn't have any of those elements. Now, to kind of confuse the issue a little bit, I want to turn you over to Mark chapter 11. Not Mark chapter 11, John chapter 13 first. John chapter 13. And this, of course, is the instance of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And you have them carrying it out, Jesus carrying it out, and then saying at the end of that, in John chapter 13, he says in verse 16, "Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. Blessed are you if you know these things." And he really demonstrates again this deep servant leadership that's a key component of what we're going to talk about. But then if you turn over to Mark chapter 11, beginning with verse 15, we have this event that is shocking. So you have Jesus talking about humility. You have Jesus talking about servant leadership. And yet in Mark chapter 11, beginning with verse 15, they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went in the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Now, when I read a story that describes an event, I try to picture it in my mind. And for the life of me, I cannot come up with a scenario where you're overturning tables humbly. How can that possibly, how can that give that perception that servant leadership is happening there? You're turning over tables. I mean, you're turning them over gently? Does anybody really think that's what was going on in that particular place? So there's a boldness that's coming into this particular scenario that is, at least on surface, in contrast to the servant leadership, the humility, the not lording it over, and the authority that's described. I want you to feel that tension. And I want us to really talk about how we can navigate that difference to where we meet both of those objectives. That we meet the objectives of that servant leadership and yet boldly lead when that's required. And I think that's really the purpose of our time together. Now, before we kind of get to some of the tactics around it, I want to get your head around another topic. It's a business topic, but I think it has great application. It's the topic of brand. The topic of brand. So I want you to think about business. And I've got on the chart here a number of great brands. And when you see these things, you may think of certain things. At least for me, when I see Honda, I'm reminded of a variety of yard tools that I've used over the years that have just incredible staying power as engines. A pressure washer I haven't started up in 3 years, starts right up, or a power generator, whatever it might be. They've got a reputation. And when you're running a company and you're going to have a powerful brand like that, everything you do has to be around and in support of that brand, or you will lose out. Interestingly, sometimes brands replace the word itself. The word tissue. It was replaced by Kleenex. So powerful that it changed our language. You could say the same thing about gelatin. Does anybody say gelatin anymore, right? It's Jell-O. Poor Royal, they're down there if you know who they are. But basically, they completely defined and redefined the word because their brand is so powerful. And then there's brands that actually create new parts of speech. They change from a noun to a verb. You don't search for things anymore. What do? You Google them, right? So it's become so powerful that it has taken over the category. I don't, take a share ride somewhere. I take an Uber or a Lyft. But that's what you do, right? So it's so defined it by the brand. And then just to drive the point home, imagine a company that has only $5 billion in assets and they owe $10 billion. $5 billion in assets and they owe $10 billion. The banker in me says, they're bankrupt, right? Because they owe more than they own. I just defined Hershey, and it's worth, according to the stock market this morning, $50 billion. Why? They're a brand. Because people look at that and their mouths start watering. They get all the shelf space. They own the brand. In other words, the way you have success is you define a brand, and then everything you do has to revolve around that brand. Now, I want you to think for just a moment about this question. From the time of Christ on, what is the Christian brand, And that will help us to find the right kind of leadership. What is the Christian brand? And that will help us to find the right kind of leadership. Do you know that there is a Greek word that for the most part did not even exist until the time of Christ? It's a word that existed in verb form, but it didn't really become into the general vernacular until the time of Christianity. That word is agape, which you know as love. Now, love, agape love as a verb existed, but it became such a key part of who Christians were and are and should be that it created a whole new definition of language. You can go read Vines about this and some of those if you're into studying such things. But the word noun for love, agape love, was reinvented. Just like Uber reinvented something and Google reinvented something, Christianity reinvented love. In fact, I would argue that the way that the church grew so fast in the first century was because it was known for its love. And you can go text by text and see the emphasis of this. And that is our brand. That should be our brand, our love of one another, the love of Christ for His church, our love for the lost, and on you could go. It should so much enthuse all of our activities as a church. That's what's going to change the world. And that starts with leadership, having loving leadership. So it is the Christian special brand. And regardless of anything that's going on, if we have that brand working, we will do very well in our leadership. I won't go through all this. I could go to all kinds of different texts. This was a slide I used in the class a while back to go through in detail some of the elements that are in it. This is in 1 John 4, beginning verse 7. But in these, 4 verses, 13 times you see agape in some form. And it talks about the loving one another, which is the reciprocal concept that's in it. The point in time where we were born of God because of His love, and so you have those elements. It's demonstrated, exampled by the giving of a son. You could go to Romans 5 and talk about God's love being poured out upon us and then going through the sacrificial atonement of Christ. We have in the middle of this propitiation, which has all the concepts of appeasement and mercy and love that are buried in it. And by the way, that's a great word study if you ever do that. It's very, very informative. And then you've got, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. The foundation of any good view of leadership in the church is this love. And when we don't exercise that, we lose our brand value. That's what has to happen. It has to show up. Now, we're not talking about the kind of love that sometimes the world defines, right? We understand all that. But there are key elements of love that have to show up in our actions as leaders if we're going to be effective in it. So now with that as a background, I want to begin by talking about 6 elements. Spend the rest of the time talking about 6 elements of loving leadership. What's it going to look like? And these are the 6. Loving leadership begins with vision. When Jesus began His ministry, over and over and over again, He said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom is at hand. Many of you will not taste the death till you see the kingdom coming in power. It was a visionary statement that pointed them to something over and over and over again. You have to have, part of loving leadership is setting a vision for the people. Having a vision that they can see and they can understand. I remember years ago, and I'm dating myself a little bit, but I remember there was a milk commercial. And a mother was talking to her little 5-year-old boy. And he said, why do I have to drink this milk? And she set a vision for him. She says, I see a tall man with broad shoulders, right? That's why I want you to drink this milk. Great advertising and all that kind of thing. But what was she doing? She was setting a vision as a leader of Him for something that he could think about and could see. Visionary leadership really requires us to have one, and then they'll also act on it and be constantly reinforcing it. You had the kingdom of heaven in his hand. In Acts 1, as Jesus is going through the ascension, he lays out sort of the next vision for them. Go to Jerusalem, right? Then Judea, then Samaria, and then all the world. By the way, that's the key text passage for church planting. That's what that is, right? That going through and doing that and laying that out. And he laid that for them as a vision for what was coming next. And they had to very much focus on that. Here's the way some leaders work. First of all, there is the need-to-know basis leaders. There is not a more horrible way to lead than to say people that are on a need-to-know basis. Sometimes that happens even in the military, right? You're on a need-to-know basis and some of those things. In the corporate world, I see it. If people are on a need-to-know basis, then they don't have any need to follow you because they're not going to know where we're going. And leaving people on a need-to-know basis is anti-loving. It basically says, I can't give you the truth of what we're trying to do. And so you may have a vision, but you're on a need-to-know basis. You just do what I say. That's called lording it over. That's what that is. That's an authoritative lording it over, and it is anti-love. Perhaps worse yet, it's leadership that has no vision, right? That they don't know where we're going. We're just doing church. We're just doing church. And I don't know how many places I've been where I ask, what is the vision for this congregation? You either get blank looks or you get some very, very high platitude generic thing. Now, I recognize the mission for the church is the Great Commission. Go in all the world and preach the gospel, teaching them to be disciples. I get all that. But that is very broad. The world's a big place. And there are many, many, many ways of carrying that out. And by the way, I don't care how big your congregation is or how much money you have, you can't do all of it. So what is the vision for your congregation in your place for what you're going to do that the people can know and they can get behind? That's the foundation of setting a good vision. There's some benefits of doing this. There's the focusing on the same thing. Everybody's rallying behind it. It provides a purpose to the work, because if people have purpose to their work, it's helpful. And we'll talk about some of this tomorrow. It solves a lot of problems. In church, everybody's got an opinion about everything, right? The people have an opinion about color of the carpet, the pews, this program, that program, what's going on. Everybody's got one. The better vision you have and the more specific, you can reorient all those conversations back to that topic, back to the vision, and spend less time on the tangential stuff that wear you out, and they do, versus the things that really matter. Now, just a little plug for tomorrow. We're going to spend the entire time tomorrow talking about how to set a vision for your congregation. And a lot of things are going to be a little bit more sort of pragmatic in carrying that out. Because I feel very strongly that we can't carry out loving leadership either informally or formally if we have not set a vision of who we are and who we are trying to be. So vision's number one. Second is modeling. You remember that Jesus began his ministry. He selected his apostles, and they watched him for a time. And then he sent them out on the limited commission. Now, they had watched him do this. They had watched him go to town and preach. In their particular cases, he healed people and worked through that process. And then they were able then, after watching it, to go and do it. Leadership modeling is very key. And it has to be a situation where, one, you've got to be willing to do something yourself and show them you're willing to do it yourself, and then get them a chance to see you doing it. And that's the only way that you're going to be able to lay out modeling. We read John 11, we were looking at the washing of disciples' feet. Yes, I recognize that was a object lesson figuratively, but he did it. He carried it out. I mean, in fact, in that culture, there was probably nothing he could do that taught that lesson more than carry. He modeled it out. I'm willing to do this, then you should be willing to do that. Now, that can show up in a lot of different ways. Um, it can show up by an elder doing a mundane task. An elder, after the fellowship meal, helping to put up tables and chairs. That it's not well, that's below my pay grade, right? It's not that mindset, right? You don't have any of the. It can happen that way. It can also help by when a elder, a deacon, or a preacher, hey, we got to go talk to somebody or go visit somebody. Come on with me, and then let them watch. These are powerful things where they get a chance to see it modeled. And that's the way people learn, is first to observe how it's done and then to begin to be able to do it themselves. Here's one thing for you to think about. The measure of leadership is how well things will operate when you're gone. That's the key. That is a fundamental thing that has to be in everybody's mind. I mentioned I was an elder for 21 years over in Charlotte, and now I've been gone 4 years. Well, I love hearing they're doing well, right? Part of that is I love to hear they're doing well, but I also love to hear the things that fall apart because I wasn't there. And I wouldn't be honest if I didn't tell you sometimes ego kicks in and I might have thought things would have fallen apart without me being there, right? That's human nature, right? But if you train and you teach and you get other people involved and you do all those things, it will work. I lost my uncle just a couple of months ago, but a couple of you may have seen the story on Facebook, but I'm going to tell it anyway. When I was 30 years old, I was traveling someplace in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and I was teaching Hebrews to the adult class on Wednesday night, which for the life of me, I'm still trying to remember why a 30-year-old was teaching Hebrews on Wednesday night, but we'll just leave that where that's laying, right? And my uncle at the time was the director of East Tennessee School of Preaching, which is now Southeast Institute or something or other. And so he had been on the road, and he walked in 5 minutes before class started. Now, anybody knows my uncle, we're talking about a significant scholar, right? He was teaching preachers on how to preach. And then we were going into Hebrews chapter 6. If you know that chapter, that has some interesting things. So what did I do really fast? Met him at the door. Hey, David, meant you just covered class tonight, right? You know what he said? He said, you prepared for it, you do it, I'll be your biggest fan, right? Now, what he understood, scared me to death, by the way, but what he understood was, if somebody else isn't doing it, who's going to do it when I'm gone, right? That's the mindset we have to have. So modeling is a key part of our loving leadership. Being affiliative. I have to tell you, I had to work at this one. We all have different kinds of personalities. Jesus was very affiliative in his compassion for people. Now, he showed it with his healing. He showed it with his interaction with people. Now, in this room, you know who you are. Some of you are introverts, and some of you are extroverts, right? The extroverts are all bubbly, and they never met, somebody that wasn't their best friend, and they easily engage, and they're endearing to people. That is not my natural tendency. Especially when I was in my 20s and 30s, I was a nerd analyst and all that kind of stuff, right? And so I just wasn't a people person. Well, I had to learn in leadership that if you're going to lead people, you have got to be affiliative. I used to start the meeting with, the agenda is boom, 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 boom. Now I start with, so how did your son do in Little League this week? Right? You do that, you've got him. You've got him, right? Because you're showing that you actually, some of us, and I was one of them, have to work at that. That's really, really important to create that affiliativeness. Now, as Christians, we do a lot of that naturally, right? So, how are you doing? Some of those kind of things. I'll tell you, we do that at a surface level. We need to go a little deeper, right? Because, at church, everybody's smiling, right? The kids were probably fighting in the car before they got there, but everybody's smiling at church, right? So we need to work on getting just a little bit deeper on some of this affiliative thing. But if you as a leader, whether informal or formal, do not have an affiliative relationship with somebody, good luck leading them. Good luck. You know, the old thing, we say this in evangelism, people don't care what you know until they know you care. Same thing's true for every member of the church. And that doesn't mean you're going to be best friends with everybody, but you've got to work at being affiliative with everybody, because that's the only way you're going to be able to lead them through it. Jesus also spent time in what I will call recreating time. Now, you know, how many times you go to the mountain and to be alone to pray, where he would go with his disciples and they would spend time together. There's a value to that. And you know, a lot of times we do that well as a church. We spend good time in fellowship and engaging in those things, and that's wonderful and that's right. That has to be there across the board. A lot of times what happens, there's the 25% of the people that do that, and 75% don't. And so working to make that happen more is part of creating that affiliative cohesion within the group. The other thing I would say that's important about affiliation, and listen to me carefully, is managing perceptions of you. Managing perceptions of you. I spend a whole couple of lessons on this with some people, but you can think about managing perceptions. Apostle Paul was taking money for famine back to Jerusalem, and he said, and I want these two people to go with me to take it back there. Was there any chance in the world the Apostle Paul was going to steal that money? No. But he was going to manage perception. Now, he could have said, well, God knows that I would not steal this money. But what he and God are interested in is what do other people perceive about you. And that's really, really key. You could argue that 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10 are all about managing perceptions. You know, chapter 9 is about the fact he didn't accept money for the Corinthians so they wouldn't get the wrong idea about why he was preaching in the first place. And then 1 Corinthians 8, about the eating meats and all that stuff. Love. It's all about love, right up front. Managing perceptions is a fundamental concept that we have to have in affiliation. Now, when you talk about managing perceptions, you don't need to see yourself through your eyes. You need to see yourself through the eyes of others, whether it's right or not. And that's hard. That's hard. I told you a little bit about the early days of my career. I was sort of a nerdy analyst kind of guy, right? And, you know, if you're in a large company at all, you go through these, 360 feedbacks, and they tell you what what other people think of you and all that kind of stuff. And somebody told me, I was like 25 years old, they told me that people think you're arrogant. Arrogant? I'm not arrogant. I'm not. But it was simply because I wasn't the communicative stuff. And that's when I realized I had to begin to learn to be more like that. I had to have a wake-up call about how I look. As a leader, know yourself. Know how people perceive you. Are you an engineer and quiet? You're going to have to work really hard to get out there, right? If you're the bubbly salesman, calm it down. Because there's a set of people that think you're just a talkative peacock, right? So there's those kinds of things that are out there, and that will endear you to a broader set of people, which then makes them willing to follow you as a leader. So be very careful about that. When in fact, I'm teaching a college class on this right now on career advice. And one of the things I say is you got to know something, you got to do something, and then you got to deal with people. And the first two are givens, but the last one's the hard one. In fact, the last one will make or break a career. After you get to a certain point, it's all about that last thing of how you deal with people. And that's what you got to work on. And don't let anybody let you think that you can say this, well, I am who I am. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that as a Christian, frankly, but you certainly do not get to do that as a leader. You need to perceive yourself through the eyes of others so you can be affiliative with them and get the chance. All right, coaching. Jesus was engaged in coaching constantly, talking to people in ways, by the way, in ways that they could handle. Martha, Martha. That's a coaching line, right? Remember that whole story and went through that and gently nudged her towards the focus that she might ought to have in that particular case. When he went to Simon's house, right? Simon, I have something to say to you, right? Because of the woman who washed his feet and those kinds of things. Peter, you got to love Peter, right? Matthew 16, he goes from hero to goat in about 6 verses, right? Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not given this to you. And then 6 verses later, get behind me, Satan. There's some coaching going on, right? There's some differences in what's happening. Jesus was always doing that, and he was trying to emphasize to them to think. There's a movie in the line, A Few Good Men, a little out of context, but the truth, you can't handle the truth. One of the things leaders have to know in coaching is how much truth somebody can handle at a given point in time. We understand this with our kids, right? You got a 6-year-old. There's some things you're not going to discuss with a 6-year-old because they're not ready to hear those things, and that's right and that's appropriate. That's also true of a spiritual person who's new in the faith. What do they need to hear? What can they get to? How far can they get? There are things that they got to change a whole lot of other things before they can change this last thing, the truth. And Jesus would do that. He would say, you're not yet ready to handle this, right? And so I've got a comforter coming that will tell you more because you're just not yet able. And so having the discernment in coaching says, here's the problem, here's the situation. How can I get them not from here to where they need to be necessarily, but just from here to here, just some improvement in what's going on. This coaching. Now, you don't get to do coaching unless you've got a lot of these other things, right? Unless you set a vision, unless you're affiliative, unless they've seen you working, right? You don't get to do that because people aren't going to listen to you. And so, coaching is a key part of loving leadership, carrying it out as a servant leader. But you got to have the other things to be able to accomplish it. Let's talk about democratic and delegation. This is really, really hard for leaders. Jesus sometimes, when he was dealing with something, he would say, "What do you think?" Right? He was trying to get them to think and also kind of express where they are, so I understood what was going on and how they thought something ought to be handled. What do you think? When they went on the limited commission and they came back, he let them go and do it. Right? That's called delegation. Right? Let them go and do it. Did they do it perfectly? No. In fact, when they got back, the things they talked about, he then coached them on. Because if you remember, what they were all excited about was, wow, we had all this wonderful power that we could do these cool things. And he was like, okay, that's great. Now let me reel this back a little bit. Let's get back to the vision and what's really important here about the kingdom. So you're focusing on that. But he let them go and to do it. Could they do it as well as Jesus? Of course not. But he let them go and let them do it. Delegation's really, really a tough thing. Remember Moses and his father-in-law Jethro and what he said, right? Because Moses was killing himself. I recognize as a leader that there's things that you can do better than other people. That's the fastest way to get to do everything yourself, right? That's what will happen, is if that's the mindset. And part of loving leadership is giving people an opportunity to go and do things their way, and maybe even trip and fall a little bit along the way, so that they can learn and grow and gain from that. So let's make this very practical and real. Somebody that was a deacon of whatever involvement, and then over time the congregation decides to select them as an elder, and there's a new deacon of involvement. Now, that elder who had been the deacon of involvement, in his mind has an invested view of how that job ought to be done. And so he sits down and he passes on the job of involvement, working on that with that new deacon. He says, now you do this, and here's your 17 steps that you follow, and then you do it this way, and then you do it this way, you do it this way. That's the fastest way to ruin somebody, to take all the passion out of the role from them. And oh, by the way, they might know something you don't, and being able to carry out that role. So yes, we create guardrails, but we don't necessarily do it. That's, and I don't know what the right necessary answer is at a given congregation, but you have a mission budget. Let's say the mission budget's, a couple $100,000. Well, the way some people do it is they have a line item veto by the eldership on everything that goes on in the mission budget. They sit down, they go line by line by line by line by line by line. Well, that's one way to do it. Another way is to go to the deacons of mission and say, here's your guardrails. We want 80% of this money to be focused on evangelism, 20% only on benevolence. We want 60% of it to be international, 40% of it to be domestic, and don't do anything where we haven't had boots on the ground. Now, what did I do? I just put boxes around it, right? Guardrails, and then let them go and figure it out. And come back and tell us what you did. That's fine. Now, maybe next year you do a different approach, but you lay those kinds of things out. That's real delegation. That's real delegation. And by the way, that's the way people grow, and that's the way you get churches to be able to go to the next level. So, delegation, and I've seen it so many times. People want you to help come volunteer with them to do a work in the church. And you'll have somebody, and I've seen this, here's the person who's in charge of the kitchen, whatever it is, right? They got their way. They got their stuff labeled. They got it the way everything happens. They got it knocked down. And then they want you to come along and be their personal slave and do it exactly the way you tell them. That's the quickest way to get people to stop volunteering. That's exactly what will happen. And so loving leadership allows enough openness so that people can do things on their own and put their own thoughts into things and can carry them out. All right, now, there is an autocratic, commanding element of leadership. And there are times for that. I will tell you that commanding leadership is useless, especially in the church, if it doesn't already have all the other elements, because nobody's going to listen. Unless you have established a framework. Now, you can say things like, well, Hebrews says that everyone should obey the elders that rule over you. Obviously, it does. Agree with that completely. But if you have to pull that out, you've already lost the battle. You've lost the battle before you start. People will follow you even when they disagree if you have all the other elements. The other things I would say is that in terms of when and how often you use this, it should be very, very minimal. I think I can count twice at Gold Hill Road where we stood up and said, don't. Right? And one of them, I remember one of them clearly. Again, this is a while back. Everybody remember Promise Keepers? The Promise Keepers came to town, and on the surface there were some things that were good about it, but underneath there were some things really bad about it. And it was a big deal, and there were some people who were going to go to all of that. And as an eldership, we got up front and said, don't go. Right? Now that is a autocratic, commanding, direct statement, right? And we did that. But that was so rare, it had a shocking impact on people, right? I'm not going to tell you nobody went, but a lot fewer went because we said that, right? So there are cases where an eldership has to be very clear, certainly on direct doctrinal matters, those kind of things. I got all that. But again, for people that do not understand, for people that may not agree, if you don't already have these other 5 things, you have a lot less chance of that being effective, right? Um, I always use the illustration in the office building. If you're on a floor of people, and this actually happened to me, 9/11, I'm in the top of a financial tower in Charlotte, okay? I'd watched the one plane hit, and then the other plane hit, and it went through my head. They're going after the financial centers of the country. And the second largest financial center of the country is Charlotte. And I'm sitting in one of these buildings. I walked out of the office. I said, everybody get out and go home now. Right? I'm just go. I didn't get, oh, why? Well, what are you talking about? Now, I got some startled looks, right? But we went out and everybody, there wasn't a big debate about it, right? Get out. Now, it turned out that was no big deal because nothing happened in Charlotte. But that was the mindset that was there. If you've got people who question you, who wonder your motive, what's he up to? What's the motives and they're going on? You won't get away with an autocratic execution command. That just doesn't happen. And I think that's really important. So think about loving leadership. Think about it's our brand. It's our brand as a church. It should be our brand as a congregation. But it should be a brand as an individual as we lead and mentor other people. And these 6 elements will help you. Let me stop there and see if you have any questions before we go. All right. Well, I appreciate you listening to me. And tomorrow we're going to talk about creating a pragmatic vision. So enjoy the rest of your day.